This is my rebuttal to chapter 1. Basically, the tithe simply means tenth. However, the tenth of what is what this debate is all about. Quote, if a legal court case were being held, a working definition would have to be agreed upon by all involved parties before the presentation of a case could proceed. End quote. I totally disagree with this premise. Let me give you two examples. First, consider the subject of abortion. There is no, quote, working definition of the word person that has been agreed to on both sides of the issue. Even the Supreme Court has acknowledged if a fetus could be proven to be a person, then the debate for an elective-induced abortion is over. Second, there is no longer, quote, a working definition today of what defines a marriage on both sides of that issue. Based on those two prime examples, we can see that Dr. Kelly's premise is flawed. Dr. Kelly begins by listing 4 definitions of the tithe. However, the third one is where I'm going to be focusing on. The first one simply is based on non-biblical uses, while the second one speaks of giving, but does not necessarily even require all to tithe or to give the full 10%. Strange, there is no mention of the Webster's Dictionary here, but Dr. Kelly does show his dislike later on in the book. Quote, they replaced the literal definition with their own man-made definition. Webster Dictionary outweighs the Bible. End quote. Yet, I've noticed that Dr. Kelly quotes from a lot of Bible dictionaries. Last time I checked, those Bible dictionaries can also be considered a man-made definition. Concerning the third tithe, simply put, the third definition is simple, 10% of one's gross income. Notice I did not quote him. I'm just giving my own personal definition. Now, it seems as though Dr. Kelly demonizes those that believe that tithing should be taught today. But would he also demonize the prophet Elijah, who asked a very poor widow who was about to have her very last meal with her son, that can he have a meal first? It was not a tithe, but her very last meal that he asked for. Since Dr. Kelly states that the tithe does more harm than good, then what about Elijah's asking a poor widow to give up her last meal for him? You can check out this in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 through 16. And even Jesus referenced the story in Luke chapter 4, verses 25 and 26. You could say, well, she was poor and she didn't tithe. Yet what was asked of her was way beyond the tithe. What may be surprising to some that read his book is that he not only thinks the New Testament tithe will do more harm than good, but he's not very positive about the Old Covenant tithe either. Quote, history proves that many centuries of compulsive legalistic tithing failed to produce moral and spiritual blessings in the Old Covenant Israel. End quote. Here's another one. Quote, and like Old Covenant tithing in national Israel, nothing good has ever resulted from such attempts to enforce tithing on another. End quote. So even the tithe that Dr. Kelly believes was ordained by God, he has issues with. It was not the tithe that failed Dr. Kelly. For if that was true, then wouldn't that mean that God has failed? No, it was the heart that was the issue back then, and it is the heart that is still the issue today. In fact, God rebuked the children of Israel in the book of Malachi, not just the priests, and we'll get to that a little later on their misuse of the tithes and not the tithe itself. If anything, it appears that Dr. Kelly shows his dislike of the tithe, period. That is an underlining theme in his book. Now, the fourth tithe, according to Dr. Kelly's book, even though this is a little long, I will read it anyway. Quote, The full tithe was given to the tribe of Levi. First, in exchange for his loss of land inheritance in Israel. And second, because of his service to his brothers in the Levitical house of Aaron, who alone served as priests. A tenth of the first tithe was in turn given by the Levites to the priests who ministered at the altar. End quote. I want you to consider something about tithing, that it teaches discipline, and it's a way to put God first in your wallet. Matthew chapter 6 verse 33 says, "But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." That is the context that I am referring to, and not what Dr. Kelly has mistakenly thought. How can one put God first if one gives as one feels like it without some type of structure in place? Let me try to illustrate what I'm trying to get across here. Should one do that with other areas in their life, or only God should remain what appears to be a structureless priority? For example, if someone has a goal to buy a house, car, or any big investment, do they put aside simply as they feel like it, or should they consistently put aside a certain amount every paycheck in order to reach their goal? If one is so engulfed in having the latest fad like a new smartphone, tablet, computer, shoes, clothes, automobile, houses, etc., and then give God a free will offering, they may only have a few dollars left or loose change to give to God. How can one be truly focused on giving to God if one is so caught up in spending on all the latest stuff first? Matthew 6:21, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be." Why would you give your paycheck to the world, but you give God your crumbs? And really think the Lord will say, "You know what? Thanks for that quarter that you put in the offering plate," as you're drinking a $5 coffee from Starbucks. Later on, I will show how the Apostle Paul will use this principle in putting God first by setting aside every week for the poor saints at Jerusalem. By the way, in putting God first, I am no way saying that the tithe and first fruits are the same. There's a big difference between the two. In fact, when it comes to first fruits, you may not have realized that I have devoted about 5 minutes to the topic on my video, "He Causes Us to Stand." In fact, I will leave a link for all to see. I will have a timestamp at 25:40 in which I talk about first fruits and how it relates to Jesus and the resurrection. Apparently, Dr. Kelly is confused on what I believe concerning first fruits. May I suggest that he would listen in my own words on the topic before he comes to an improper conclusion. Proverbs 18:13 says, "He that answereth the matter before he heareth it, it is a folly and shame unto him." Matthew 6:24, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." See, by setting aside a certain amount from each paycheck, then one would be a disciplined steward of what God has blessed you with. If it is true that most of us have certain bills like housing, transportation, food, clothing, medical, etc., that we are to be disciplined in order to pay for them, then why would God's house be any different? Especially if you call yourself a believer. Where is your priority on that matter? Do you pay for your bills with your loose change, or do you consider what bills need to be paid and what you can spend for yourself afterward? Does Uncle Sam get his percentage, but God just the leftovers? Remember, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22, 2, verse 21, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God's. So where is your treasure? Is it on the world or on the kingdom of God? Next, Dr. Kelly mentioned, so there were many occupations, but only the farmer and herdsman tithed. Quote, also strange as it may seem, scriptural tithing was intended for a society sustained almost wholly by agricultural crops and animal herds. End quote. For the sake of argument, let's say he's right. That is why tithing is different in the New Testament. Since the majority of that society was herdsmen or farmers, according to Dr. Kelly, then it makes perfect sense to do it that way. However, I believe there was a hidden wisdom in the way God did the tithe in the Old Testament. No matter what line of work a person did, there are two things that were always needed: food and clothing. Food and clothing came from two things: the farmer's crops and the herdsman's flocks. I believe since God gave Jacob wisdom concerning his wages with Laban in Genesis chapter 30, verse 37 through 43, which came right after he promised to tithe, and I'll get to that a little later on, since Jacob would be the father of the children of Israel, then why is it so hard to see that God could give the farmers and herdsmen wisdom also? Just like a businessman, God understands economics. I will give you an example of something they probably learned, even if they were the only ones that paid tithes. Others unknowingly paid the difference. Here's how. Suppose a herdsman would normally sell a sheep for $100 each. He knows the 10th one he would lose $100. So why would he want to sell sheep if he could sell tables and not have to lose profit? Here's how. If he sold 9 sheep, he makes $900, but the 10th he loses $100. Instead, he sells the 9 sheep for $112 each. He makes $1,008 and gives the 10th for a tithe. He simply passes on the cost to those that buy for him. Since everyone needed food and clothing, everyone was in a way involved in the giving. See, that's why tithing should be taught, because it really is a clear way to put God first in your wallet. In fact, those that don't believe in tithings for today, but do you set aside an amount by faith before you even get to church? And you're probably thinking, why am I asking this? I mean, do you look at your bank account and say, I know it'd be a step of faith, but I'm going to give $100 today at church? Or do you get to church and only then decide by a faith response to give $20? At least with tithing, there's a consistency, whether you think about giving before you get to the church or during the church service. In doing a faith response, my question is, would you have the same response before going to church versus when the offering plate is passed around? I believe that's a fair question, for if we are only to give by a faith response, then I would think the Holy Spirit would prompt you to give the same, whether it was before the service or during the service. The reason why I am mentioning this is, how do we handle our other bills? Why would our other bills, will we look ahead of time to make sure we can pay for them, but God, only when we're tugged at the offering plate, will decide what he gets. That is why I had mentioned earlier about putting God first versus throwing a quarter in the offering plate while you're drinking a $5 Starbucks coffee. After all, the Apostle Paul will talk about being consistent in our giving. When I get to the New Testament, I will go in greater detail on the matter. Dr. Kelly also states some miscellaneous topics which he will go into more detail later on, and I will cover those topics as needed. But here is a very important part of this particular chapter I want to center in on: the meaning of the tithe. Have you ever thought, why 10%? Hey, we can all speculate, and I'm going to speculate myself, but I believe I have good scriptural reason. Now, some will say, well, we have 10 fingers. That's why they tithe. Or it's easy to count by tens. That's also true. Look at even our metric system. That's based on tens. In the next chapter, Dr. Kelly will claim that the tithe of Abram was just an old era custom. In general, pagans tithed long before God's people did, according to Dr. Kelly. One of the things you will see, I do not like to argue history, because in this particular chapter, some of the ones that he talked about tithe, referring to pagans, came after Abraham, and yet he claims that this is before Abraham. Whatever the case may be, to me it's the scriptures that we should debate and not history, because that's always going to be a black hole anyway, and I'll talk about that more later on. I don't believe for a minute that God saw all these pagans tithing and then thought to himself, man, how come I didn't think about that? No. I believe that 10% is something that was actually built into creation itself. For example, just to show you how natural it is, what are you most likely to hear? The 10 best pizza places in New York City are, or the 11 best pizza places in New York City are. How about the 9 best-selling cars in America? Or the 10 best-selling cars in America? When's the last time you heard someone say, that girl, man, she's a perfect 9? No, I've always heard that girl is a perfect 10. How about the top 10 grossing movies this past weekend were, or the 7 top grossing movies this past weekend were? In the Bible, the importance of the number 10 is clearly seen. God spoke 10 times in the creation account. Genesis chapter 1. The most holy day of the year in ancient Israel was the Day of Atonement. That was on the 10th day of the month. Leviticus 23:27. In Abraham's intercession of Sodom, God told Abraham that he would not destroy it if he found 10 righteous there. Genesis 18:32. When it came to sacrifices, over and over, the flour that was used in the offerings was measured out in tenths. Check out Numbers chapter 28 and 29. In fact, I encourage you to look up tenth deal in the Strong's Concordance. Most of us would think of, the 10 Commandments or the 10 plagues, but the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn. And that's all connected with our topic, Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. Notice what the 10th commandment was, thou shalt not covet. That also applies to our topic, and that was the 10th commandment. Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. Jesus spoke of the 10 virgins and 10 talents. Matthew chapter 25. In the book of Revelation, Jesus spoke of tribulation for 10 days. Revelation 2:10. I can continue, but you should have gotten the point by now that the meaning of 10 is something very important to God, and I believe it's God's divine order. God used the 10th in measuring out what was to be rendered back in income by the tithe, by the flour in the offerings. God's order, he set the most holy day of the year on the 10th day of the month, and at what point he would even spare a city. Yet, what is important is that God is the one that gives increase to the farmers and herdsmen. All other occupations, a person can say, hey, look, I've done this. For example, a carpenter could say, I made 50 tables. A tent maker could say, I made 10 tents. Yet no farmer or herdsman could claim that, but must rely on God to provide the increase. Deuteronomy chapter 14:22, thou shalt surely tithe all the increase of thy seed, that the field bringeth forth year by year. The word increase in the Hebrew simply means income. So we can say, thou shalt truly tithe all the income of thy seed. Simply, the increase was their gross income. And that's how that can tie in with the third definition, that the tithe is 10% of one's gross income. We can take it right out of the text. Now, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament will take this very principle of the increase and apply it to the gospel. I'll get into more detail later on. I have one last thing to share. Here's a quote I want you to consider. Quote, "A tradition is not automatically an eternal moral principle merely because it's very old, very common, and very widespread." End quote. Dr. Kelly will expand his premise that the tithe is not an eternal principle. Yet, later on, he will attempt to use the tradition of a rabbi and attempt to impose it on the church today. Yet what can be concluded is the number 10 is that which is natural, but also that which is supernatural. For out of the supernatural increase of God, a tithe was a key part of that which was rendered to God. With that being said, chapter 2 is a storehouse of errors that I will address very soon.